stage.
So while I was researching this claim of fact, I found this really interesting story in the Washington Post. In the early 1980s, Elizabeth Dole was the Secretary of Transportation under President Ronald Reagan. And she took on a quixotic crusade to save the American motorists from themselves. You see, she had this preponderance of evidence that said if Americans would just fasten their seatbelts, thousands of lives would be saved. So she got together with some of her public health buddies. She made some deals with the automakers, and lo, Click It or Ticket was born. And it worked. Within 3 years, 38 states had ratified laws for mandatory seatbelt use. To this day, only New Hampshire is the only state that does not have a mandatory seatbelt law. Elizabeth Dole had saved us. Not that anyone had asked her to. That, my friends, is my statement of claim today. The primary mandatory seatbelt laws are unconstitutional. They violate both the 14th and the 4th Amendments. Today I'm going to tell you about how they violate those amendments. I'm going to tell you about a ridiculous ruling from the Illinois State Supreme Court. I'm going to tell you about how a judge in Washington, John Castleberry, ruled that it was an illegal search to search someone's private property after they've been stopped for a seatbelt. And I'm going to tell you about a very scary report from the ACLU that will make you happy that you are not a black man in the state of Florida. But first I want to make sure we're on the same page. Primary mandatory seatbelt law means this. This is according to the California state statute. If I'm a police officer and I see, or I think I see, you not wearing a seatbelt, I can stop you and cite you. I can also detain you, search you and your personal belongings, i.e. car, and I can arrest you. So let's go on to my first fact. Primary seatbelt laws violate the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment says, I want to make sure I get this right, that no state shall deprive any citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process. That means I have the liberty to do whatever I want as long as I don't hurt anyone else or any other thing. To me, a mandatory seatbelt law defies that constitutional right. And back in the early 80s, when these laws were getting passed, a lot of other people thought so too. Civil rights activists challenged this law's constitutionality. Now, unfortunately, it went to the state Supreme Court in 3 different states. And in a ruling by the state of Illinois, sorry, this just makes me crazy when I hear this. The People versus Corrig in 1986, the Illinois State Supreme Court ruled that, yes, you do have the right to liberty, but those are only liberties in certain things. Motherhood, your home, your speech. Now that just drives me insane. Either I am free or I am not free. If you follow that chain of logic, the state of Illinois can now create a law that says how much salt I can take in. They can mandate that I have to exercise 3 times a week. They can say that I can only have 2 Vicodins with my milkshakes. You know what, actually that's probably a pretty good idea. It's unconstitutional. I'm either free or I am not. Now let's go on to the 4th Amendment. Okay, again, I want to make sure that I say this right because it's a direct violation of the 4th Amendment. The 4th Amendment states that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated. I'm a poor, starving college student. There is nothing more personal that I have that is my car. My car is it. That's the most personal thing I own. And when a police officer peeks into my windshield to see if I'm wearing a seatbelt, my friends, that is an illegal search. And it should not be allowed. And a judge in the state of Washington says that if you are stopped, you should not be able to be searched. And in California state statutes, they say that's true. You can search someone's car after you've been stopped. So, according to the Citizen Review, Washington State Court, John Castleberry, my new hero, ruled stopping a suspect solely on the grounds of wearing a seatbelt was not enough grounds to search their vehicle. This was back in 2002. Now that does not stop anybody from still getting seatbelt citations. However, it's been stopped now of searching the car. Police officers will not, this is according to the police organization of the California Highway Patrol, they will not search your vehicle without just cause. So finally, I want to tell you about this ACLU report that came out in 2012. Mandatory seatbelt laws are being used to violate constitutional rights of African Americans. The ACLU came out with a report in 2012 that said over twice as many African Americans are cited for seatbelt laws than whites. Per capita, that means per 100,000, 970 whites versus 1821 blacks. That's over twice as amount. Now, some of you may say, well, maybe black people just don't wear seatbelts. I don't know, right? But according to a survey by a separate entity, the Florida Transportation Safety Board, they found that the disparities were actually quite small. 85.8% of blacks wear their seatbelts. 91% of Caucasians wear their seatbelts. Now I'm going to do the math for you folks. That is not double. It's racial profiling going on in the state of Florida, and they're using seatbelt laws to do it. That's unconstitutional. Look, I'm not saying that seatbelts don't save lives. Elizabeth Dole was right, we should. But it is my constitutional amendment right not to. I think that it is an illegal search when a police officer looks in my car to see if I'm wearing a seatbelt. And I think we can all agree there's something really wrong going on in the state of Florida, and they're using seatbelt laws to do it. And that, my friends, is unconstitutional. Thank you. I got lost a little bit. There was nothing I could do. Good?
It's like an accident report is out, so.
All right, Michael, the opening story is okay to kind of identify the topic, but it sounds at first like you're going after seatbelts and their effectiveness, and I think that that's maybe a little problematic. Your tone probably should be adjusted a bit to reflect that your focus is really on the constitutional question and the legal issues that are going on. The preview that you presented kind of lists topics, but it doesn't make claims as clearly as they should. In the body of the speech, I thought your first two claims, though, were a lot more clearly stated. The Washington ruling and the ACLU ruling, I'm confusing it with UCLA, the ACLU ruling or review, those are not really claims, they are pieces of information, so they don't really fit as secondary points unless you make an inference from them. And that's what you need to do, is you need to tell us what the inference is and then say these things support those particular inferences. I think at the end of the speech we've got a pretty good idea about what your last inference is, and that that the ACLU report supports that particular point. But at the beginning of the speech we don't know exactly where you're headed with it, and I think that that's a little bit problematic. you have a tendency, I think, to paraphrase the information that's being presented here instead of quoting it directly. I think that some of the court rulings, for instance, need to be contextualized a little bit more. The Illinois thing, I think, is a place where you kind of go off on some tangents based on inferences about how the ruling would be perceived. And I'm not saying that, look, I don't like people telling me what to do. I'm not one of those folks who thinks that everybody should be told what to do about all kinds of things. But the first question I have is, okay, courts are the ones who rule on this sort of thing. And if it's a constitutional issue, it's not just the state courts that are ruling on these issues. So you've got a Illinois case that you make reference to, you've got a Washington case that you make reference to. I'm going, okay, and where is the federal case that was ruled on? And that's what you need to tell us. You know, that the only rulings that we have, there haven't been any federal rulings. Either the court has dodged the issue entirely, it hasn't come up in front of them, or that the state rulings have all been accepted by the court and they've just, like I said, they've said it's up to the state constitutions, it's not a federal constitutional issue, which I think is, but that's the point that you're making, because it's the 14th and the 4th Amendments that you're talking about, so there have to be some, and if there aren't any federal cases, that's okay, but you have to explain to us why they didn't become federal cases. Let's face it, when you say by this logic, the state of Illinois can force us to do X, Y, and Z, well, isn't that the ruling that we had 4 years ago on the Affordable Care Act that says, the Supreme Court says you can do this as long as it's done through a tax, we can force people to do these particular kinds of things. As long as it's a tax, the government has the right to do the taxing kind of thing. That's in the constitutional. Okay, so then how does this fit inside of that? I think there's an analogy that could be drawn to that particular point that would be a little bit stronger than the one that you have. I think it's presented very effectively. You speak to us well. You've got passion in your voice, and you look at us the whole time that you're talking, which I appreciate. It makes me feel a little bit more like you understand the concept that you're talking about. I do think that if the CHP isn't doing this thing, treating it as a issue to search people's cars, which that's what you said,
Right.
then all of a sudden that kind of undermines your argument. But if your argument is that that's what they're doing in Florida and other places, then I think that you need to kind of explain. California has recognized these limits and other states haven't recognized these limits, and that's a problem. Right. That's the way I think you want to present it. Otherwise, that piece of information seems to suggest, well, then we don't have to worry about our, Fourth Amendment rights under this because those are protected, that sort of thing. And it seemed to me like a lot of the states, and I don't remember, have secondary laws as opposed to primary laws as a way of addressing these kinds of issues. So I think there's a little bit more context that we need as well. All right, I've been yammering too long.